September 1st, 2022 marks the 7-year anniversary since the release of Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. Despite its age, people are still actively discussing the game and making theory videos ranging from nuclear disarmament in Metal Gear Online to the missing Chapter 3 of the story, and even the mysterious vlog number 36 on Konami's official website. The game was a critical and commercial success, but a common consensus between fans is that the game is simply unfinished. The latter half of the game repeats the same missions from the first portion, and the ending to the story feels rather abrupt, when compared to the extensive narrative build-ups you see in the other Metal Gear games. Some people say that the reason for the Phantom Pain's incomplete nature is due to Konami's interference and outright sabotage of the game to prevent further development costs. There are also people that claim Hideo Kojima wasted a large sum of the budget for no good reason. Comments like these made me want to research the development of the game to find out what exactly happened behind the scenes. But there were a few problems. The development of Metal Gear Solid 5 isn't as well documented as you'd imagine. Unlike Metal Gear Solid 4, which had a whole mini-documentary showing the staff at Kojima Productions working on the game, the only info you can find on the Phantom Pain comes from the Collector's Edition Blu-ray, Yoji Shinkawa's art book, and a handful of interviews with Kojima. And while the information in question is indicative of some of the content that had to be cut, the finer details were never really mentioned. I'm going to use this video as a way to make sense of the development cycle behind the Phantom Pain, with a general timeline at the end of the video. To start off, there are a few key figures that must be identified. These include the Phantom Pain itself, its prequel, Ground Zeroes, the Fox engine, and Hideki Hayakawa. Most of these are self-explanatory, but Hayakawa's effect on the development of Metal Gear Solid 5 may not be too apparent. The individual in question is currently the president of Konami, and he steadily kept rising through the ranks ever since his mobile game, Dragon Collection, was released on June 14, 2011. The success of this title is one of the key factors why Konami as a company started deviating further and further from developing AAA games, which explains many of their decisions regarding the Phantom Pain. Just keep that in mind. Sometime after the release of Metal Gear Solid 4, Kojima Productions started working on a brand new engine that would help them make the best looking games they could. The engine in question was first revealed at E3 2011 and featured footage of assets that would later be used in the Phantom Pain. You could consider this as the starting point of the title's development cycle and the first of many problems it would have. Developing a brand new engine requires a lot of time and resources, and while the Fox engine was later utilized on 12 separate products by Konami, it was proven to be quite difficult to use, which led to it being discontinued by Konami in the wake of the new console generation. The overall costs that went into the engine's development were never openly stated, but a quote from an anonymous Konami employee in the book PT, A Video Game History, estimated that the joint cost of the Fox engine and Metal Gear Solid 5 was around $100 million, or an equally absurd amount by their estimates. The generally accepted development cost for Metal Gear Solid 5 was stated to be around $80 million, so you could argue that the Fox engine cost around $20 million to develop. It's an investment that could be excused, due to Konami now being able to develop all of their upcoming games with this graphically astounding tech, which they wound up using for 7 years. Sometime after the Fox engine's reveal, Hideki Hayakawa released the mobile game Dragon Collection, which was immediately proven as profitable. It was a project infested with microtransactions and pay-to-win mechanics, which intrigued Konami and pushed them to implement said mechanics in their other franchises, including Metal Gear. More on that later. At this point, several announcements were made, starting with the first mention of Ground Zeroes leading up to its official release in 2014. The reason why it was released as its own project was so that the MGS fans would have something to play until the Phantom Pain finally released, as they seemed to have run into some difficulties during development. One of the many issues plaguing the development cycle was the fact that the game had to be released on 5 separate systems, those being the PlayStation 3, PlayStation 4, Xbox 360, Xbox One, and PC. The PS4 was apparently sent out in the form of development kits as early as in 2012, before being publicly announced in January of the following year. This means that Kojima Productions would have received the kits just in time to start proper work on the PS4 version of Phantom Pain before that game was even announced. The Fox engine was a perfect fit for the console, so you could save a ton of money by simply releasing Metal Gear Solid 5 on next gen. But the decision was made that both Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain would have to be released on all 5 systems I've mentioned before. Presumably, it was a way for them to recover costs from the development so far, but I believe that it was this decision that ultimately led Metal Gear Solid 5 to being seen as incomplete in the eyes of many. With the number of consoles Kojima Productions had to deal with, it was presumably Konami upper management that decided to put a $30 price tag on Ground Zeroes, which led to major criticism. Furthermore, the title had some noticeable performance issues on the older hardware. The Fox engine ran significantly better on the PS4 and Xbox One, to the point where a brunt of the work during Phantom Pain's development was spent on downgrading the graphics and fine-tuning the overall performance so that the game could run properly on last-gen consoles. By the time Metal Gear Solid 5 had finally released, the PlayStation 4 was already 2 years old. Despite all of these issues, Ground Zeroes had already shipped 1 million copies by April 2014, and the development cycle of the Phantom Pain continued. On July 3, 2014, Hideki Hayakawa became the vice president of Konami Japan, replacing Hideo Kojima. This event led to further tension between Kojima and upper management, because the low-effort mobile game that Hayakawa had made was generating millions in profits, and Kojima was working alongside his team to make one of the best AAA games they ever could, even with the increased costs of next-gen development and Konami's predetermined mandates. Millions of dollars were invested, and they still had a year to go until the game finally released. Content had to be cut, missions had to be restructured, and they even had to make a multiplayer mode that worked on all 5 systems that were mentioned. Things were looking grim. It was later revealed that the development process was slowed down even further due to direct obstructions from upper management. Kojima was separated from the rest of the development team in the form of an isolation room, and Kojima Productions as a whole had to deal with limited internet access and cutoffs mandated by their superiors. Events like these are sadly frequent in the Japanese gaming industry, used as a way for employers to get rid of their underlings without causing a breach of contract. In this instance, that would equate to Konami actively making the working conditions of Kojima Productions more difficult so that the team would leave of their own free will. If you want to learn more about these underhanded tactics, check out Resonant Ark's video on the topic. Whether this was all a way for Konami to force a quicker release of the project, or just a personal vendetta against the team, is irrelevant. The results speak for themselves, and all that's left is to see what the game would eventually turn out to be. Once the Phantom Pain officially released, it was met with universal acclaim and sold 3 million copies in the first few days alone. According to online sources, the game would have to sell 6 million copies in order to break even. And it did, by the start of 2016, and the number of copies sold just kept going. Now, here's the funny thing. I'm not sure how accurate this quote is, but according to Forbes, the number of PlayStation 4 copies that were shipped made up 72% of the overall sales, while the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 equated to around only 5% of the overall sales. As I've stated before, by the time Metal Gear Solid 5 was released, the PlayStation 4 was already 2 years old. Unfortunately for consumers, there was no chip shortage that would make the system impossible to find in retail. Whether or not you believe these percentages is up to you, but I feel that the Phantom Pain would have been a bigger success had it just focused on next-gen consoles. It would have given Kojima Productions more time to implement new missions and cutscenes. They could use their resources more efficiently, and we would have gotten a more complete product. At this point, we might as well address the whole Kojima likes to waste money assumption as well. To that end, allow me to compare the Phantom Pain to another Metal Gear title, that being Guns of the Patriots. Metal Gear Solid 4 was an equally ambitious project, but it had plenty of things going for it when compared to its successor. For starters, it was only ever released for the PlayStation 3, and I cannot stress enough how much of a difference that choice makes in the long run. One of the main reasons why a game like Cyberpunk 2077 turned out as broken as it was upon release was because the team didn't have the time to fix all of the issues between all of the different platforms where it had to be released. Moving on, let's compare the time that passed from the announcement of the game to its release. Metal Gear Solid 4 was first announced at E3 2005, and then released on June 12, 2008, so roughly in 3 years' time. While the Phantom Pain was technically revealed on March 14, 2013, as part of Hideo Kojima's ruse, we know that the title's development had begun long before then. So instead, we will use the announcement of Ground Zeroes as the proverbial starting point. Ground Zeroes was announced on August 30th, 2012, and Metal Gear Solid 5 finally released on September 1st, 2015. Once again, around 3 years had passed. Now, as for the development costs, things get a bit problematic. There was a rumor circulating around that Metal Gear Solid 4 supposedly cost between $50 and $70 million to develop, though this rumor was proven false by former Kojima Productions member Kenichiro Imaizumi. No concrete number was ever revealed, but if you take under consideration the rough estimates of development costs from other sources, you will arrive at an estimate between $10 and $30 million. It is still an exorbitant amount, but we are talking about a game that was released for one system only. Meanwhile, the only real data on the budget of The Phantom Pain comes from this bizarre article by Nikkei that everyone seems to have accepted as a fact. For the sake of the argument, we'll go with the premise that this was the genuine cost of development. The final metric is the number of copies sold. With MGS4, there were 6 million copies sold as of 2014, and with Metal Gear Solid 5, it was roughly the same as of 2016. You can see quite a few similarities between these games, with the main difference being that no one claims that MGS4 was unfinished. Beyond that, there were plenty of other issues at hand. For starters, it's been 6 years since Metal Gear Solid 5 was released, and we haven't seen any further updates on the number of copies it sold. You could simply say that it just didn't sell well after the start of 2016, but you need to consider that Konami also released the MGS5 Definitive Experience later that year. What's more is that if you compare the Konami Group corporate profile from 2021 and 2022, you will see that an additional 1.1 million copies of Metal Gear Solid games were sold, despite no new titles being released in 4 years. When you look at the MGS games available for legal purchase, you'll notice that most of the franchise hasn't been available on PlayStation or PC for a while, which is an issue that Konami intends to resolve in the future. This means that the brunt of these sales would either have to come from The Phantom Pain or Metal Gear Survive, and with all due respect, I don't think Survive managed to sell that well after all these years considering its critical reception. Aside from the number of copies sold, there were additional profits made from The Phantom Pain. The point is that even if Metal Gear Solid 5 hadn't released on last-gen consoles, it still would have been a commercial success. Maybe we wouldn't even be talking about it with such disappointment today, but look back on it as the perfect send-off to this franchise. Kojima has gone on record to say that he was proud with everything that he and his team had done for this title. But you would have to wonder about everything we had to lose in order for this game to be released, even in this particular state. Ground Zeroes had to be sold separately at a marked up price to recover costs. The latter half of The Phantom Pain repeats a number of missions from the first half before abruptly ending with a narrative twist. There were the microtransactions I've mentioned earlier. Metal Gear Online had to be delayed despite being teased in December of 2014, eventually releasing on October 6, 2015 for consoles and January the following year for PC. Battle Gear was no longer fully operational, presumably because it would ruin the performance of the game on older hardware. Episode 51, Kingdom of the Flies, was cut in its entirety, despite parts of the mission cutscenes being available on the Metal Gear Solid 5 Collector's Disc. Chapter 3, Peace, was found in the game files and steadily hinted at by Konami and Kojima through the nuclear disarmament of Metal Gear Online. There was even this supposed leak, this one-off picture that indicated that the game would have a total of 5 chapters. At this time, the act of nuclear disarmament in Metal Gear Online is the last strand of hope the community has for a revival or redemption of Metal Gear Solid 5. Whether or not there is something behind that act, I would still like to ask anyone who's watching this and owns the Phantom Pain to give the multiplayer a shot. It's still really fun. Lastly, I would like to express my sincerest gratitude to all of Kojima Productions for all that they've done for us and the Metal Gear series as a whole. Despite all odds, they still gave us a phenomenal game that we still talk about. I wish them the best of luck in their future endeavors. Thank you all for watching this lengthy video. There isn't much else that I could say about it really. This was simply a topic that I felt strongly about and felt like it had to be shared. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, take care of yourselves and have a great day. Cheers.